Well, good morning. I literally was in my room 1 minute ago. Got a desperate call that you're running way ahead of schedule. And so, fortunately, I was ready. I picked up a bad habit when I was in grad school, I think. I was an academic, so we oftentimes run late. But fortunately, I was ready to be here. But I wasn't quite expecting to be on stage this quickly. But it's an honor to be here in order to make sure, lessen the number of people who may be disappointed. I am not Christophonic. This is not all you need to know about sex. You can't beat that title. Chris is wonderful, but that's not me. I also know that I am right before lunch. Now, so many times when I've given speeches during my political career, I would be the one that would speak right before dinner. And I would see, and everyone in the room would see the waitstaff just waiting for me to finish so I could start passing the food out. Now, at least I'm before lunch now, and I was disappointed I'm right before lunch, but it's in the schedule. You know, lunch is not until I think 12:15, so if I end early, it doesn't mean you can get lunch any earlier, so I don't have to worry about that. But I won't plan on using the extra time since I'm starting early. Anyway, it's something that is obviously near and dear to my heart after serving in Congress for 16 years is what do we do? What are we called to do in terms of serving as a public servant, more importantly, as a Catholic public servant? So late last year, I was speaking to a former colleague of mine in Congress about the threat posed by the divide in our country. Now, this former colleague of mine told me they used to refer to himself as an evangelical Christian, but he recently started to say that he is a non-denominational Protestant. His reason? He saw too many evangelicals now thinking their faith needs to serve their politics. He told me he believes that this is adding to the crisis of the divide in our country, as well as tearing churches apart and really hurting their role as Christian witnesses. Now, this comment didn't really surprise me too much, but the next thing he said really did surprise me. This Protestant told me that his hope for our nation and the problematic divide now lies in the Catholic Church. Now, if you know anything about the history of anti-Catholicism, past and present in this country, that's an amazing statement. Now, as a pro-life, pro-family, pro-religious liberty Catholic Democrat who served in Congress for 16 years and stood athwart our nation's divide, I know that Catholics are the hope for our nation, but only if we have the courage to be Catholic first. Now, polls show that Americans across the political spectrum believe the divide in our nation is a serious threat. But why does it seem so dangerous now more than in the past? It's because there's recently been an elemental change in the nature of partisanship for many Americans. Partisanship is now rooted in many people's social identity. Research has shown that this identity is now so powerful for some people that not only can determine or change their policy preferences, but their partisanship can also change their self-identified religion, class, or even their sexual orientation. Today, our culture tells us that partisan identity is binary. Ironically, it's telling us this is something that is binary, that everyone must choose to join a team, Democrat or Republican. Then we must conform ourselves to be a completely dedicated team member, or risk banishment as a heretic. But it's not love for one's own that holds each team together. It's contempt for the other side. Arthur Brooks has told us very much about how disastrous contempt is. So what we have now in our country is not just tribalism, it's sectarianism. It's partisanship as a fundamentalist pseudo-religion, which includes a 100% commitment to party dogma in certain leaders, along with a strong sense of maintaining internal purity and external distinction from those who are on the outside. Politics is viewed as a zero-sum game focused on winning by using any and all tactics to destroy your opponent, because the end justifies the means. Now, in most elections, we usually need to vote for members of one of these two parties. Making this choice does not make one a political sectarian. But an increasing number of Americans are becoming sectarian in their politics, on the left and on the right. They're making their political party their faith. But we're all here at Napa, so we, I believe, all understand there's something different going on the left. It's not much of a stretch to see reflections of the French Revolution. Roger Scruton, in a 1989 essay entitled Man's Second Disobedience, says the French Revolution was not a reaction against abuses of power, but was a war against religion, a rejection of the God of Christianity and the sacredness of the human person, a rejection of humans as imago Dei. This played out in the late 18th centuries in ways that are eerily familiar to what we see in our country in the early 21st century. With no God-given basis for human dignity, life could be discarded for the public good, which was defined by the party of the revolutionaries. Today, we have abortion and assisted suicide. The dogma of the revolutionaries demanded unattainable ideals which did not serve justice, but only served to delegitimize rival powers. Think of the use of the term equity today, which is used as a cudgel to tear down institutions, organizations, and individuals who are accused of various violations of equity. The French revolutionists also claim that only they could speak for the people, and that protesting members of these groups merely betrayed their collective identity. Today we see this when women are called traitors to their sex because they are pro-life. And when we see Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, he's accused of hating his race. The revolutionaries also displayed contempt for compromise and engaged in a demonization of opponents because they believed that opposition cannot be met, is not the object of negotiation, and can be the beneficiary of no agreement. Opposition is to be destroyed. But destroying the political process was not even enough. Scruton says the revolutionaries infected all public processes with the sense that they are without justification, meaning that all authority was illegitimate. In the late 18th century France, terror reigned. Tens of thousands were put to death, and millions more died with the destruction of French society in the ensuing Napoleonic Wars. Now, I'm not necessarily suggesting we're headed to the same fate, but as we see the rise of the sectarian left, we need to ask ourselves, what is the proper, faithful Catholic response today? As I worked in the midst of national political battle for the past 2 decades, I've always looked for guidance to the patron saint of politicians, statesmen, and lawyers, St. Thomas More. After a long career in public service, More was chosen by King Henry VIII to serve as his Lord Chancellor of England, the highest position in government below the king. When King Henry's marriage annulment was denied by Pope Clement VII, he decided to reject the Pope's authority and declare himself the head of the Church of England. Thomas More knew he could not give his assent, and he resigned his position as chancellor. He gave up not just extraordinary power and honor, but his livelihood. The king, however, understood More's moral stature in the eyes of others and continued to pursue him, pressuring him to sign the oath of succession, renouncing the authority of the Pope. More refused. In the following year, he was convicted of treason and sentenced to death. As he put his head on the block for execution, More is reported to have said, "I died the king's good servant and God's first." In this statement, St. Thomas More gives us our Catholic response. Be Catholic first. Not sometimes or most of the time, but every day, in every situation, big and small, public and private. The world would have said that More had many legitimate reasons to set aside his Catholic convictions. Most of the bishops in England had gone along with the king. For More, going along would have allowed him to maintain his extraordinary influence over the king's rule. He would have been able to continue taking care of his family. But More understood we must never place any values, organization, group, individual, or our own power, pleasure, wealth, or honor above our faith. But More also shows us that we must understand Catholic first, not as Catholic only. Or more appropriately, I should say being Catholic also means we have other obligations in life. One of these obligations is the civil authority. More makes this clear when he declares that he was still the king's good servant. He had dedicated his professional life to public service because he strongly believed in the import of the authority of government and laws. In the play, in the movie A Man for All Seasons, More declares, "I'd give the devil benefit of law for my own safety's sake." Though Robert Bolt, the play's author, took creative license with this line, it accurately captured More. As Robert Bork wrote in First Things, More believed that if an acceptable mix of freedom and order are to be maintained, obedience to law must be accepted as a primary moral duty. The Catechism states, every human community needs an authority to govern it, and the duty of obedience requires all to give due honor to authority and to treat those who are charged to exercise it with respect. The Church also declares support for the principle of the rule of law, in which the law is sovereign and not the arbitrary will of men. So, given this, where do the teachings of the Church in the example of St. Thomas More lead me? As the Democratic Party became more radical on abortion, family, religious liberty, and more sectarian in punishing heretics such as myself, I continue to run and serve as a Democratic member of Congress to fight inside the party to change it through my witness. But I did not back down in living the truth. Though I watched plenty of my colleagues on both sides choose their party and power over their professed faith. More than once, I had a constituent come up to me in my district and say to me, "I know you vote Catholic." Sometimes it was a criticism, sometimes they were thanking me. In 2018, after 14 years in Congress, I faced a brutal challenge in the Democratic primary, fueled largely by millions of dollars from pro-abortion groups, the Human Rights Campaign, and the Soros family. This tremendous effort to defeat me, even though I was only one of 435 votes in the U.S. House, demonstrated that these groups believed that my lone voice in the party was a threat. I very narrowly won that 2018 primary, 51-49. And though I knew they'd be back after me again in 2 years, I stayed outspoken and active in Congress in protecting life, speaking up for religious liberty, and standing alone on my side against transgender threats to women's sports. By 2020, this made me a political leper in my party. People who had previously supported me ran away. I was outspent by more than 2-1 in the Democratic primary in 2020, and my opponent was endorsed by 5 presidential candidates, a number of my Democratic colleagues in the House, and the mayor of Chicago. 2 days before everything was shut down in Illinois because of COVID, I narrowly lost the 2020 primary election. I certainly did not want to lose. I did not want to give up the honor and privilege of serving my constituents and my country. But I never regretted my politically fatal choice to not become a sectarian Democrat. This year, some Republican elected officials asked me to run for Congress in their primary, and a group of my supporters tried to convince me to run in a Democratic primary. I turned down both sides and considered running as an independent. As an independent, I plan to offer an alternative to sectarian partisanship and a common sense agenda for the common good. It's what we really need in this country. Earlier this month, I decided not to run this year, to the delight of both Democrats and Republicans, and I won't go into it now, but I can tell you more about that. They both made it clear to me, both Democrats and Republicans made it clear to me that they did not want me to run. But I'm not going to give up on my fight for our republic against sectarianism. I continue to believe that we all have a duty to our country, the rule of law, and the Republican, small r Republican, government set up in our Constitution. Our government was designed to force deliberation and compromise because the framers believed that these were necessary to maintain freedom and democracy while keeping our very diverse country united. If the people's representatives rejected working towards conciliation of differences, they thought that America risked 2 extreme threats: the loss of our republic to tyrannical rule, or the collapse of the nation because the government was viewed as illegitimate. We are already beginning to see the sprouting of these 2 threats. While a policy divide on many issues makes legislating difficult, sectarian partisanship makes it virtually impossible. The ensuing congressional gridlock leaves a power vacuum filled by presidents who act beyond their constitutional power, as well as by an unelected administrative state and activist judges. this is not the republic of our Constitution. In addition, both sides are questioning the legitimacy of elections, lawmaking, and the actions of elected officials. This has been used as a justification for the misuse and abuse of institutional power inside the government on both sides. It has also inspired mob activities on the outside, including the rioting and looting in many cities in 2020 and the January 6, 2021 incursion at the Capitol. If nothing changes, if both sides continue to be led by sectarian partisans, how will we keep our republic? Now, a couple things I want to address before I finish. I know that there are thoughtful Catholics who believe our republic is not worth saving. The Catechism does call us to voice our just criticism of what seems to be harmful to the dignity of persons and the good of the community. It even states that armed resistance to oppression by political authority can be legitimate, but only if 5 conditions are met. These include: it is impossible reasonably to foresee any better solution, all other means of redress have been exhausted, and such resistance will not provoke worse disorders. We need to ask ourselves, have these conditions been met? In addition, I would ask, if we do not want the republic of our Constitution, what type of system would we seek? What will be the human cost to get there? Would the system work, or are we engaging in utopianism? Given these questions, do we want to take our country down this road? Some claim that we can faithfully fuse our partisanship with our membership in the body of Christ. But political messianism is problematic. First, neither major party is completely in line with how our Catholic faith directs us. In a policymaking arena, political considerations will always result in partisan policy agendas taking precedence over Catholic common good policies. In addition, if we fuse our partisanship and our faith, political victories will come to be seen as divine imperatives and the mission of authentic Christian life. This can lead to the belief that legal, institutional, and even moral constraints can be ignored since the stakes are so high. This creates a danger for our country, the church, and our souls. Just as my colleague saw this happening in evangelical churches, we all know the Catholic Church has its own issues with the growing political divide that is distracting us from our work for Christ. Now, these are tough times, as we've been hearing about over these days. We've been reminded of it. It's a very difficult time, increasingly difficult, to be a Catholic in this society, in this country. However, there is no comparison between America today and the cruelty and the brutality of the Roman Empire at the time of Christ. Yet from a small group of believers, the church succeeded and spread very quickly through the example of Christians living as Christ had taught. American sociologist Rodney Stark has written, "The primary means of Christianity's initial growth was through the united and motivated efforts of the growing numbers of Christian believers who invited their friends, relatives, and neighbors to share the good news." In those first centuries, Christianity did not grow through a political movement. Jesus did not say that people will know his disciples by their political victories. He said, "All will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another." There are two things that sectarians on both sides are very good at. contempt, and destruction. A favorite aphorism of Roger Scruton was, "Good things are easily destroyed, but not easily created." Legendary Speaker of the U.S. House Sam Rayburn had a more colorful adage that conveyed a similar idea. "A jackass can kick down a barn, but it takes a carpenter to build one." Right now, we have plenty of the former and too few of the latter. Jesus, the carpenter, needs more carpenters. He needs more of us to courageously live his message to counter the hopeless political and social agendas being offered today. While it can help to get the right person in the White House, the right people into Congress, winning elections should not be viewed as the way to build the kingdom. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with wanting to win elections. As I said, I certainly didn't want to lose. But almost 5 centuries ago, St. Thomas More was courageously willing to lose much more than that. In the eyes of the world, he looked foolish, perhaps naive, about politics, power, and the ability to bring change. But almost 100 years ago, in 1929, G.K. Chesterton said, "Thomas More is important today, but he is not as important now as he will be in 100 years from today." Chesterton was right. More's witness has never been more powerful. When we leave here from Napa, I pray and hope that we are all strengthened in our call to be witnesses for Christ as we build the kingdom of God. But we will only be able to do it with God's grace and with the courage to set aside partisanship, personal comfort, and our fears, and be Catholic first. Thank you.